Good morning and welcome to another episode of Woman of Faith. My name is Dionne. Some people call me Mama Jean. We will be doing episode number 8. We'll be talking about Deborah. She was a judge in Israel. So let's find out how something so long ago can actually inspire us today and how we can take that right from the pages of the Bible. The year is now 1370 BC. That's a very, very long time ago. And Deborah, well, who was she? Who was Deborah? Deborah was a woman of God. She was a wife. She was a prophetess, and she was a judge in Israel. She was a spiritual and political leader of her time, which is very, very unique because she was a woman. It was a male-dominated society, and as a patriarchal society, it favored the men. And now here we find Deborah. She's judging Israel. Very unique, very different time. So no doubt about it. Israel favored the male over the female. And so now we begin the story of Deborah. Men retained their dominant role in the society, and women also were accountable, and they were accountable for any criminal law just the same as a male. If there was any idolater or anyone that was involved in the occult practices, they had a death sentence, and it applied to the woman as well. And she also they had to honor both mother and father, parents together. If they had a rebellious son or daughter, or they took them to court. Imagine that today. Imagine that today. But that was the era. That was the time we're talking about. Men were responsible for the well-being of the family. And so, therefore, women were not a personal possession. But the central concern of the Mosaic law was that families were the issue. It wasn't a matter of gender. It was a matter of family. So don't miss this point. The law was not a statement on male and female relationships, but more to accomplish a different purpose, to keep the family intact for future generations to come. And as we see right here in our society today, the family is falling apart right before our eyes. And maybe we can learn a lot of lessons from the past. You know, they say we grow with the new and we learn from the old. So maybe there's some lessons that we could learn. Obviously, the Lord chose her to lead. And I'm sure that was very, very difficult because she had many obstacles. She was very, very special. She was brave. She had guts. And most of all, she had wisdom. So in the book of Judges, we find that the judges ruled for a period of about 350 years. And at that time, the people would go up to their judge and they would try to settle disputes. The people were, according to the law, they were judged, the law of God at the time. So that was a whole different era. There were many judges, but only 6 major judges that we find in the book of Judges, and Deborah was one of them. Deborah was the type of a judge that she was not a military leader. Most of the judges were, but she was not. But what she was a prophetess, which means that she spoke for God, and the people knew it. And where the people, when a leader leads, the people follow. And so somehow, some way, she found her position in life, and she was very powerful in that position. We find that Deborah must have had, she had a lot of different things to judge. I'm sure it went from inheritance problems and disputes to domestic disputes, to criminal disputes, to property disputes. There was a lot. And in that time, she must have gained a lot of wisdom. So we find a situation where it's important in our day also to have godly leaders and a direction, to be able to have guidance and to make good judgments. Is there someone in your life that you feel that you could go to for good judgment, that you can feel that maybe you're doing the right thing and you want to be blessed by God? It's a godless society right now that even seems a little strange for us to be talking that way. But Deborah was connected, and the people knew it, and they did follow. So there was only one other judge in that time that was a prophet, and that was Samuel. He was the last judge of Israel, and that was just before Israel had a king. But before that, those 350 years, they had judges, and that judge was the ruler of the land. So now they handled, like I said, all kind of legal disputes. But Deborah would sit under a palm tree, and the people would go up to her. Obviously, she was situated on an incline, a hill, a mountain. I really don't know, but she was on the highlands. And at that time, the people of Israel lived on the highlands. The Canaanites were on the lowlands, and we'll explain more about that as we go. But he used her in a powerful way, and she was a woman of action. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you were in an unusual situation? Maybe you felt discriminated against. Maybe you felt outnumbered. Maybe you felt that you really were out of your element. But somehow, some way, maybe you too had to take an unusual action. So where are we in history? In history, when Israel entered the promised land under Joshua, they were supposed to conquer all of the Canaanites and drive them out. And they had problems. What was the reason for those problems? We're going to see that in Judges 1:19. We're going to read from God's own word. What was the problem? So it says in Judges 1:19, so the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland because they had chariots of iron. Well, what does that mean, they had chariots of iron? Didn't Israel have chariots of iron? What was going on there? Well, the Canaanites were in the land long before the Israelites conquered the land, and they had the secret of iron making. They had powerful connections with other powerful nations like Egypt and Syria, and they had wealth and they had the means. Israel was more of a rural life in the high mountains. They lived in small villages, and they grew their own food. They made their own clothes. They had to meet all their own needs, and they were basically poor. So that was the condition that things were in. But what were the conditions that led to them being oppressed by the Canaanites? Because obviously, when you are oppressed, you're going to rise up and you're going to do something. They had been oppressed for 20 years. So what happened that they were oppressed for 20 years? It's important when you go into battle, whatever you're doing in life, that you would want the Lord on your side. It's important that you feel that you're doing the right thing. And come to think of it, don't we make judgments every day of our life? And so it's easier when you feel that you have a higher power that's on your side and you're doing what you think you believe he wants you to do. Sometimes we get deceived by that and think that what we're doing is the right thing, but it has to line up with his word. That's the key. So what happened in Israel is that the leaders would die, the people would go back into what I call the sin cycle. They would repeat their sin over and over. And the biggest sin that Israel had was idolatry. We're going to see how that angered the Lord. We'd read it from the word. But even in our lives, we have sin cycles. And sometimes that we feel that we're close to the Lord, and other times that we feel that we have drifted. And sometimes we're not really interested in the Lord or interested in his ways or his word. We're not interested in anything. But we will reap the consequences of our actions, because for every effect there is a consequence. And God, in his mercy, has given us instruction, and he wants us to be protected from future problems. So anyways, we're going to go into Judge 2:11 and read from there what's going on. It says, "And then the children of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they served the Baals." Okay, they forsook the Lord their God, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among gods of the people who were all around them, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They provoked the Lord to anger. In our nation today, in our world today, in our families today, in our private lives, are we provoking the Lord to anger? One of the biggest things is idolatry. And there's so much idolatry in the land. There's so many other gods. There's only the one true God, and then there's all these other false gods that are all around us. And not only that, we worship objects as gods, and we worship, whether it be wealth, it could be whatever we put before God is really idolatry. So, but this was blatant idolatry. There's so many other things that have creeped into our society that you have to say, is this of God or is this of another religion? That's what you have to examine. But that's if you're concerned and if you really do care. But if you are a person of God, you will care. Sometimes you unknowingly, things happen and you don't even realize you're in a position of going under some kind of a banner that you don't belong there. But you don't know that. But sometimes he'll tweak it and you'll know it. It goes on further to say in number 14 of Judges 2, "And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. So he delivered them into the hands of the plunderers who despoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemy all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies." So, I'm thinking of America right now. Have we angered the Lord? Have we pushed him out of our society? Can we expect him to no longer maybe favor us, that maybe our enemies will rise above us? Is that happening today? Look at the news. You can answer that question for yourself. We don't want to be in a position where we anger the Lord so that he no longer stands with us against our enemies. That's not a good place to be. Well, anyways, so goes the story of Deborah. But it was always a pattern. It kept happening over and over again. It seems like then they got oppressed, then they were in distress, then they would cry out to the Lord would deliver them, and this is how he delivered them back then. He rose up judges. And so he was always for the oppressed, the poor, and the humble in spirit, and he had mercy. Many, many times they kept repeating the same thing, and he had mercy. So we'll read that in Judges 2:18, where it says how it happened. He said, "And then the Lord raised up judges for them, and the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved by pity, by the groaning because of those who oppress them and harass them." Look back in your life. Have you been harassed in your life? Has there been either a situation, a person, or something that happened that you felt that you were being harassed? There's a lot of bullying going on in this world. If it isn't in the past or in the now, it probably will be in the future. So it's nice to know that you have someone that you can go into battle with if you feel that there is a need for battle. But anyways, the Lord always rose up judges. And Deborah was one of those judges. Israel again did evil, repeated the cycle, always committing idolatry. Do we do that sometimes and we're not even aware of it? So what was happening in Deborah's time? Deborah was in a situation where there was a king of the Canaanites. His name was Jabin. He had a commander of his army. His name was Sisera. And King Jabin had 900 chariots of iron at his disposal. Israel had nothing like that. And they feared them. They feared them. And for 20 years, they were harshly oppressed and harassed. And so in walks Deborah. So she rises up and she awoke. What did she awake from? Obviously, she had the zeal of the Lord with her. And when people respect the leaders, they'll follow. And Barak, he was a military leader at the time. That's one thing she was not. She was not a military leader, but she sent for him. And in Judges 4, 6 through 9, we're going to read the story of how that happened and why this was such an important event in history. We have Judges 4, 6 through 9. So she sends for Barak, and she tells him, "Has not the Lord of Israel commanded, go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor, and take 10,000 men of the sons of," it was called Naphtali, and the sons of Zebulun. "And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, and his chariots and his multitude at the river of Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hands." And Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you do not go with me, I will not go." Wait a minute. Wasn't he the military commander here? What was he hesitating about? I guess he didn't have the faith of Deborah, or he wasn't sure. He was hesitant. He was a little bit reluctant here, and Deborah was not. So we didn't know how she was going to answer him, but she did answer him. And so she said, "I will surely go with you, but nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." We'll see how that plays out later. And so Deborah arose and went with Barak. He needed her strength. He needed her influence. He looked to her for encouragement. He wanted her with him. That was an awkward thing. Women didn't go into battle. So there we have a judge with a military leader, and he's not going unless she's going. And, there's so many times where the woman has been discriminated, but God does not discriminate against women. They have different roles, but he does not discriminate. And sometimes he will appoint, regardless of the gender, the person he wants to take care of the job. And he appointed Deborah. Well, the story continues. But anyways, it's very interesting when you really think about it, because she had to have so many things going in her mind. She had to balance her family. She was still a wife. I don't know if she was a mother. It doesn't say, but she was still a wife. She had to have domestic chores. She worked outside of her home also. She was in a very leading position. So the Lord delivered them, and not one of them lived. Not one of them lived. They were all slain by the sword, and Sisera fled away on foot. What's interesting is that she was led to victory in the midst of some very, very dark days. God performed a miracle. He had torrent rains, he had certain weather conditions, and all the conditions were tuned in to the events in favor of Israel. Israel was outnumbered, they were outmatched, and the others also had some very heavy iron equipment. So it wasn't even a close battle. But with God, all things are possible, and the tables were turned. So we want to say something, too. Her name means honeybee, and it's how appropriate is that? She was sweet to her people, but she stung her enemies, and so she was someone to be feared, too. What happened to Sisera? We don't know, but in Judges 4:17, it tells the rest of the story. It tells the story of what happened. He fled to another area, and that's in Judges 4:17. It says, however, Sisera had fled away on foot to a tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hazor, and the house of Heber. So in other words, her husband was in favor of the Canaanite king. He had an alliance, and he was in favor of that. And Jael went in to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my lord, and do not fear. And when he had turned aside with her into her tent, she covered him with a blanket. And he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. He must have been exhausted. He just came from battle on foot, running for his life. So he said to her, stand at the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires of you and says, is there any man there? Say no. So then Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg. I'm like, am I reading this right? She took a tent peg and a hammer in her hand, and she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple, and it went down to the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary, and he died. That was the end of him. So now we have her that's favoring Israel. She went against what her husband had an alliance. She favored Israel, and she did whatever she was inspired to do. She took a big risk. Anything could have happened. He could have woke up. Her husband could have come in that was quite a risk. However, we see some things here that happen. Sometimes in our life we have to take risks. It doesn't seem like maybe we just got to take a risk. And then it was Barak pursued Sisera, and he found out that Jael, another woman in the Bible, had done this, and that he realized that Deborah's prophecy had come true. It was by the hand of a woman that victory would be had. And so it was. So on that day, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, in the presence of the children of Israel, and the hand of the children of Israel grew stronger and stronger against the king of Canaan until they destroyed. And Deborah was the one who brought peace for 40 years in Israel because of that one event. They were no longer oppressed. They won the battle. They pursued, and Deborah was a prophet, and she said what was going to happen, and it happened. Well, the story goes on, and there's a lot of highlights because Deborah goes on to write a beautiful song. It's in Judges 5. It's a very long song, but I'll give you some of the highlights of it. On Judges 5:7, it says basically that the travelers at that time, the highways were deserted, and the travelers walked along the byways, and the village life ceased, and it ceased in Israel until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. So whether she was a mother or whether she considered herself a mother in Israel, she had a maternal instinct. She was going to protect the children of Israel, and she did a fabulous job at it. And then again in that song, and it goes on, she says, my heart is with the rulers of Israel. She goes on and says, Then the survivors came down, and the Lord came down for me against the mighty. Has the Lord ever fought for you and you knew it? I don't know. Everyone is different. Well, anyways, the end of the song, she writes, most blessed among women is Jael. My goodness, Jael killed somebody with a peg, through his brain. It was like, wow, that was a different turn of events. She was the wife of Heber, and she's blessed among women. She was part of the victory song. And so, therefore, we have a situation that at the end of her song, she says, thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord. But let those who love him be like the sun that comes out in full strength. So the land had rest for 40 years. And that's something, that the land had rest for 40 years. So that's the end of the questions, the end of the story of Deborah. But we are Deborahs in a way in our own lives. How many times have we had to judge situations? Imagine how many times we judge throughout our lives. Parents spend time helping their children discern and resolve conflicts. They do. How do they help them? They're either going to help them in a godly manner, or they're going to help them in a worldly manner, or maybe a very negative manner. We have to be very careful how we train our children. So God can use you in this generation. You are courageous warriors, or you can be courageous warriors. But let me say this. Don't be a warrior. WORRIER. Be a warrior. WARRIOR. But, for God, I just love that. But for God, that word, but for God, is all over written in the pages of the Bible. So many times we're going our own way, but for God. So I'm going to say goodbye for now, and thank you for listening to our program. I hope that you could take some lessons today that we heard that maybe that will help you in your journey in life. But remember that you too can be a woman of faith. Thank you for listening.